Thank you very much. In this talk, we move on from one politically incorrect subject to another. Situated in Portugal Row, just to the south of Lincoln Inn's Fields, once stood the Duke's Playhouse, later the Theatre Royal, whose infamous neighbour, John Wilmot, the second Earl of Rochester, raised the bar for outrageous excesses soon after the restoration of the monarchy. It was from here, on the 9th of December 1726, that the impresario Christopher Rich staged and perhaps wrote and performed in a sketch pantomime entitled The Surrey Wonder, an Anatomical Farce. No script survives, but this contemporary print reminds us of the production. Lord Rochester would have delighted at such a performance, with all its rakish connotations, its baldy wit, brutal malice, unwavering scepticism and frank sexuality. The Surrey Wonder was, if nothing else, sensationalist. The pantomime recalled the ongoing affair of Mary Toft of Godalming, who between October and December 1726, and there's no real easy way to say this, so I apologise for those of a weaker disposition, between October and December the 26th, managed to cram live rabbits, bits of butchered dead rabbits, into her vagina and force them back out again at will. It's the first time I've said that word at a conference. Her claim captured the attention of a raft of conversant, impulsive and misinformed individuals, all of whom travelled from far and wide to see her perform. The affair also gripped the imagination of a more pedestrian public whose insatiable appetite for lurid detail was catered for by the eager-to-please journalists. Yet, this case fairly divided public and scholarly opinion because it pitted progressive notions of scientific logic against more established beliefs in religion, secular magic and superstition. This division was reported in Mist's Weekly on the 19th of November 1726, which read, "People after all differ much in their opinion about this matter, some looking upon them as great curiosities fit to be presented to the Royal Society. Others are angry of the account and say, if it be fact, a veil should be drawn over it as an imperfection of human nature." It is fair to say that such confused rationality perpetuated from the top down. The poet, Alexander Pope, wrote to John Carlyle, the second Baron of Dunford, saying, "I want to know what faith you have in the miracle at Guildford. All of London is upon it this occasion. It is divided into factions about it." While in a similar vein, Lord Onslow of Clarendon Park in Surrey expressed to the eminent scientist and collector, Dr. Hans Sloane, "This affair has almost alarmed England, and in a manner persuaded several people of sound judgment that it was true." Perhaps unsurprisingly, the pantomime never caught on. Only 2 reviews have survived. The first from Bryce's Weekly Journal, simply reporting on the comedy affected by newly delivered rabbits running wildly around the stage, which they wrote raised such a laughter as perhaps has not been heard upon any other occasion. The second review from Mist's Weekly highlighted the more serious issue of reputational damage inflicted on those associated with the affair, who, after exposure of the fraud, it was reported, were flinging their bitter pills at one another to convince the world that none of them understand anything of the matter. Before I look closer at the humiliation inflicted on the key witnesses to the rabbit births, we need to understand the course of their individual actions. This satirical print, attributed to William Hogarth, based loosely on the adoration of the Magi and entitled Caniculare, or the Wise Men of Godalming in Consultation, introduces the main cast. Lying down on the job in the centre of the picture is 25-year-old mother of 2, Mary Toft. In 1726, her husband, Joshua Toft, a poor journeyman cloth worker, and his mother hatched a plan to convince locals that Mary was giving birth to live and dead animals and animal parts. Such a claim was perhaps not as far-fetched as it would first appear, as many believed in maternal impression, whereby if a pregnant woman thinks, dreams, or are startled by, say, rabbits or eats large quantities of rabbit flesh, then in theory she could bring forth rabbits. The Daily Journal reported on the 14th of November 1726, "The woman hath made an oath that 2 months ago, being working in a field with other women, they put up a rabbit who was running from them. They pursued it, but to no purpose. This encased her in such a longing to it that she, being with child, was taken ill and miscarried. And from that time she hath not been able to avoid thinking of rabbits." The same principle applied over a century later, when the Victorians explained the horrific mutilations of Joseph Merrick, the Elephant Man, as being a result of his mother being scared by a circus elephant. Like Merrick, it would appear that what she had to gain was the potential to earn appearance money at the numerous freak and sideshows in and around London. On the extreme left, aiding and abetting the toffs, were at E, Edward Coston, the rabbit getter, and G, his wife Mary Coston, the nurse or rabbit dresser. Between these two, live rabbits and dead rabbits and bits of rabbit and cat were surreptitiously smuggled into the chamber. In the centre ground, marked up at B and described in the engraving as an occult philosopher searching into the depth of things, is Samuel Molyneux. Molyneux, the third and only surviving child of the celebrated astronomer, antiquarian, philosopher and constitutional writer William Molyneux, was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society in 1712 and rated George Berkeley, Edmund Halley, John Locke, Isaac Newton and Christopher Wren as his friends. At the Hanoverian succession, he was created Secretary of the Prince of Wales, later George II, a position he loyally fulfilled for 13 years. Molyneux became involved in the rabbit scandal on the 15th of November 1726, 11 days after the story broke. He and the self-confessed surgeon and anatomist to the king, Nathaniel St Andre, arrived in Godalming just in time to see Mary Toft give birth to her 15th rabbit of the day. As a keen astronomer, lens grinder and telescope maker, Molyneux's interest in the inquiry was optical rather than anatomical, a point revealed by Toft herself, who described him as the purblind gentleman surveying me with his telescope. A view later broadened by Alexander Pope, who wrote in his poem, "But hold," says Molly, "first let's try, now that her legs are opie. If aught within we may descry by help of a telescopy. The instrument himself did make, he raised it level and right, but all about was so opaque, it could not aid his sight." At sea, just behind Molyneux, the figure with hands aloft in merciful praise and a speech bubble above reading a sooterkin is James Mowbray, a Scottish physician and great advocate of maternal impression. Referred to here as the sooterkin doctor, there is no evidence that he attended Mary Toft's monstrous births. However, in 1724 he did publish a pamphlet entitled A Female Physician, in which he tells us of his first-hand experiences with sooterkin births, sooterkins being a small mouse-like animal which he claimed was often born to Dutch women who sat too long over warm stoves. The two other wise men depicted here at A is Nathaniel St Andre, who Hogarth draws doing a jig, a less than gracious reference to his earlier position as the king's dancing master. And on his far right at D is Dr. John Howard, of whom St Andre described as a man of known probity, character and capacity in his profession, who has practiced midwifery for above these 30 years. Described here as the Guildford rabbit man or midwife, Dr. Howard is scurrilously shown receiving a rabbit from an accomplice at the door. To recreate the play, we have to look at pamphlets published throughout the course of the affair by the main players. On the 4th of November 1726, John Howard broke the news that Mary Toft was giving birth to rabbits, a claim that Nathaniel St Andre tells us was supported by most of the people of Guildford who have had the curiosity to go and see her. Further births were reported on the 6th and the 9th of November, prompting Howard to write to a senior royal apothecary stating that the 12th rabbit, I believe, I should take from her at 6 o'clock. I have 11 of them already in spirits. Inspired by their experience at Godalming, Molyneux and St Andre returned to court, apparently convinced the claim was true. And within days, an anatomical demonstration was set before the king and his senior physicians. St Andre's own account, entitled A Short Narrative of an Extraordinary Delivery of Rabbits, performed by Dr. John Howard, was written in London on the 28th of November 1726 and published 5 days later. Although Samuel Molyneux did not publish specifically on the subject, he did endorse his companion's pamphlet, albeit cautiously, with the following comments. I have carefully read the above narrative. Whether the animals mentioned therein were produced in this woman, or that a fraud is practicable in this case, I cannot take upon me to say. Gentlemen who are sufficient judges will determine the matter upon proper evidence. I cannot certify that I did draw up a relation, as is above mentioned, which in the most material circumstances of fact agrees with this narrative, and I can further affirm that I did not perceive the least circumstance of fraud in the conduct of this affair while I was at Guildford. While all this was going on, the king's surgeon, Syracus Allers, and Mr. Brandt, a relation of Mr. Jago, the king's apothecary, went to Guildford and witnessed firsthand the delivery of 16 rabbits. According to John Howard, Allers was so convinced that Mary Toff was genuine that he gave her, in St Andre's words, a guinea and promised her a pension from His Majesty. But in truth, Allers had violent suspicions of the whole matter, a situation that so concerned Howard that he pulled together witness statements from the Mayor of Guildford, his own brother, the surgeon Thomas Howard, the landlady of the White Hart, where the German surgeon lodged, the wife of local saddler, and from Mary Toft herself, all of which testified that the German doctor thought that the public would not believe a fact so true, adding, he examined her breasts, getting waylated, he examined her breasts and found milk in one of them. Allers went on to print, accusing Howard of obstruction in not allowing him to touch or examine the patient, and noting that it was impossible to observe distinctly what he was doing, and in particular, the motions of his right hand. Furthermore, he was concerned about the dryness of Mary Toft's delivery, and the fact that one of the rabbits appeared once to have lived on dry land and fed off of grass. On the 29th of November, Mary Toft was brought to London, staying at Lacey's Bath House in Leicester Fields, where the London Gazette reported great numbers of the nobility had been to see her. Dr. James Douglas was one of those who attended, but despite having labour pains, Mary Toft failed to deliver any rabbits. Desperate to please, a small rabbit was acquired by Mary's sister-in-law and smuggled in through the back door of the premises. The deception was finally uncovered. Mary was arrested but claimed that the rabbit was to eat. She finally confessed when threatened with very painful exploratory surgery by Sir Richard Manningham, a fellow of the Royal Society and College of Physicians. Manningham wrote to Molyneux on the 6th of December 1726, exposing the whole affair, while a day later Parker's Penny Post reported that Toft was a grand impostor and cheat. Manningham immediately published an exact diary of what was observed during the close attendance upon Mary Toft, the pretended rabbit breeder of Godalming in Surrey. And Mary Toft issued a full published explanation early in 1727. The exposure of the fraud set in motion a further sequence of events whereby those implicated defended their damaged reputations and tried to desperately shift blame. For avid followers, the retractions and justifications raised further issues of personal decorum and double standards, while for the impudent satirists, the opportunity to parody and chastise learned men of science as ignorant, predatory fools was too good to miss. In consequence, a dirge of ballads, cartoons, and satirical poems were published, the most notable contributions being Caniculare, the cartoon we saw earlier, the poem, The Discovery or Squire Turned Ferret by Alexander Pope and William Pulteney, and the pamphlet, The Anatomist Dissected, or The Man Midwife Finally Brought to Bed by Jonathan Swift. Between November 1726 and January 1727, the Toft affair appeared on 63 occasions in gazettes and public papers. Such media was enthusiastically received and discussed in coffee houses, where, as César de Saussure described in 1726, workmen habitually began the day in order to read the latest news, entirely composed of censures and satires against ministers and the government. St André was quick to defend his reputation by retracting claims he made in his earlier optimistic pamphlet. In a letter in the Daily Journal and the Daily Post, he stated, "Having contributed in some measure to the belief of an imposture in a narrative lately published by me, I am now so thoroughly convinced it is an abominable fraud, I think myself obliged in strict regard to publish a full account of its discovery, with some considerations of the extraordinary circumstances of this case, which misled me in my apprehensions thereof, and which, as I hope, they will be in some measure excuse the mistake made by myself and others, and will separate the innocent from those who have been guilty actors in this fraud." Dr. Hamp, who was implicated by St André as a witness to the births, followed suit by publishing in the same papers, "I do hereby declare that my name has been used without my knowledge and consent, which I should never have given in the matter of truth, of which I did not believe in the first place." On the 15th of December, John Howard in the Daily Post wrote, "I shall always be ready to take both my oath and sacrament that I am entirely clear of having any hand in the imposture, but did really believe in the truth of the production of rabbits." 2 days later, Miss Weekly depicted the so-called learned men as backpedaling hypocrites who, they wrote, "find themselves mistaken at last in their judgment of that affair, and are healing their reputations as well they can by writing pamphlets." The greatest humiliation, however, came with Toft's published confession entitled Much Ado About Nothing, or The Rabbit Woman's Confession, which was high satire in itself and inflicted huge damage to those who attended on her. Perhaps in an effort to overstate the wise men's embarrassment, great emphasis was placed on Toft's stupidity, her confession being written in puris naturalibus, that is, in her own style and spelling, without amendment or adulteration. It is likely that the author of her confession was Jonathan Swift. She describes St André as a pretty man who played sweetly on the fiddle, adding, "He would have jumped the Lord knows where, if Mount have had his way, and shaked the powder out of his wig, but I liked him better for that. If I could have had my will, he should be the only man I would have been concerned with." Dr. John Howard, who also appears kindly, but is implicated in the fraud when she says, "He always told me I was a woman who had great natural parts and a large capacity." Of the navs and fools, she disliked Mowbray, who she claims wanted to make a devil's dam of me, and peeped, the devil's peeped his eyes out, in hope to see a dancing devil cut a caper out of me belly, but he was disappointed. Dr. Limbrock, another who witnessed the births, was labelled a fumble-fisted fella who was never cut out to handle a gentlewoman. Manningham, she said, was the worst of them, with a neck like a crane. While regarding his merciless trick to get her confession, she wrote, "As for those various experiments which they intended by sending a cheap chimney sweeper's boy up my fallopian tub, I thank them for their love, but they shall not play any tricks on me. Showing little regret to those whose reputation she had left in tatters, she claimed they were mad, a fine kettle of fish, adding, "But what is that to me? I am resolved to clear myself and let them get off the best they can." So how did their reputations fare? Anne Toft, Mary's mother-in-law, was committed to the House of Correction at Bridewell. She penned a full confession and then cut her own throat from ear to ear. Nathaniel St Andre published a note in the Daily Journal on the 9th of December, admitting his and others' mistakes and acknowledged the whole affair as being a fraud. Proof that reputation was in part based on circumstance is suggested by St Andre's avoidance of the worst of Pope's lampoonery, a consequence of the two men becoming firm friends after the surgeon saved the poet's hand after a coaching accident in 1726. Jonathan Swift was not so benevolent. In his publication, an autonomous dissected, or the man midwife finally brought to bed, written under the pseudonym of Lemire Gulliver, he examined St Andre's conduct and lampooned him as stupid, ignorant, and an inadequate surgeon who would have equally believed that a woman could give birth to 5 cucumbers or indeed 100 letters. Running into multiple editions, this pamphlet offered a cutting critique from which no man could reasonably recover. To add insult to injury, St Andre was later prosecuted by Mr. Lacey, master of the Bath House in Leicester Fields, for Mary Toft's unpaid expenses and lodgings. He was ordered to pay £56, 14 shillings and 10pence, and St Andre never re-established his reputation. John Howard, who was also implicated by Swift, was tried under suspicion of conspiracy to cheat. He was bailed for £800 and appeared in front of the King's Bench in May 1727, but was discharged without any prosecution. To be fair, the jury is still out on whether he was knowingly part of the scam or if he was somehow too duped by the Tofts. Sir Richard Manningham, who brought Toft to London after visiting her in Guildford, absolved himself through his own publication on the affair, in which he stated the need to communicate to the world, as well as for their satisfaction, as for the justification of my own conduct. However, his reputation did not escape without damage, as seen in a contemporary ballad entitled St Andre's Miscarriage, and it reads, "St Andre, Sir Richard, who have made all this bother, what would you not give for these rabbits to smother? But since no more rabbits are sold in its meat, that a ballad should be sold through the street." Samuel Molyneux, the quarry of Pope's vicious satire, remained silent on the subject, presumably in an attempt to cosset his reputation as a sober, honest and trustworthy intellectual. While his public character was severely damaged, his reputation in the physical sciences remained much admired, although this too was challenged when the experimental philosopher Zachariah Williams accused him of stealing his method for ascertaining longitude using a system of magnetic variations of the compass. Molyneux never lived long enough to fully assess the damage to his personal and professional reputation. In 1728, he collapsed in the House of Commons, and despite being treated by St Andre, died soon after in his London townhouse. His friend, William Whiston, who had defended Molyneux's reputation during the rabbit scandal, described him as a great friend and patron, while the maritime inventor, Hamu de Samurai, wrote, "All men of learning and ingenuity has lost a great friend." In death, he suffered 2 further indignities, both at the hands of St Andre. First, within hours of his passing, St Andre eloped with Molyneux's widow, Elizabeth, in her own right one of the richest women in the country, to Southampton, where they eventually married and established a significant estate. Second, in 1730, Molyneux's nephew, the author and clergyman Samuel Madden, accused the surgeon of administering a fatal dose of opium, a murderous claim that was never proven. These humiliations further sullied Molyneux's reputation by compounding murder with scientific ineptitude and the marital infidelities of his wife, whose own reputation has since been defined in sexual terms. His reputation recovered soon after his death with the posthumous publication of his scientific research by James Bradley and Robert Smith, but declined again during the 19th and 20th centuries when the rabbit story prevailed, a legacy of later generations being captivated with tales of moral depravity, fantasy and fear that turned Mary Toph's fraud into popular fable. And Mary Toft, well, she was labelled a notorious and vile cheat, and on the 9th of December 1726 was sent to Bridewell. In the Daily Journal 2 weeks later, she was described as being dangerously ill. Being released without charge in April 1727 begged one social commentator to suggest that it was proof that she was really innocent of all charges after all. He argued the authorities would have released her if there had been any reasonable grounds to prosecute. Yet Toph's reputation in the 18th century celebrity culture was secure. She had her portrait painted by John Laguerre. Daniel Defoe, in his tour through the whole island of Great Britain, noted that Godalming's main claim to fame was as Mary Toph's hometown. And despite being committed to Guildford jail for receiving stolen goods in 1740, she was a regular at dinner parties hosted by the Duke of Richmond. Unlike many of those she duped, her obituary was published in London papers in 1763 alongside tributes to peers and statesmen. One of the great appeals of the Rabbit affair was that it portrayed a reversal of the Restoration notion that it was the rural working class population who invariably fell foul to the more articulate gentry class. In essence, the illiterate and impoverished Mary Toft set out to fool the establishment with a fraud so debased and grotesque that investigation by any man, however learned, would have been considered both physically and morally degrading. In consequence, despite all their influence, intellect and power, those associated were humiliated and their reputations were dragged down further by mischievous Tory satirists and the surreptitious aggression of the Jacobite social commentators. To these ends, they would have been well within their rights to have considered themselves victims of the unregulated press and partisan political skullduggery. The rabbit scandal of 1726 remains proof, if ever we need it, that celebrity culture, trial by media, and our ability to shame and disgrace public figures has changed little through the centuries. Thank you.